Hello, and welcome to the Culture Roundtable, brought to you by Culture and Sports, where culture is critical to long-term success. For the past 2 years, Culture and Sports has been educating and influencing organizations, teams, coaches, staff, and even athletes about the importance of culture and leadership in sports, as it greatly impacts organizational success, team and athlete performance, and the short and long-term mental, physical, and emotional health of athletes. Leadership and organizational culture adversely or positively have a cost and impact to every organization's bottom line, not only with fans in the stands, concession sales, and merchandise sales, but broadcasting, advertising, and endorsement deals. We believe in our mantra, culture is critical to long-term success, and strive to promote this every day. Positively influencing others and educating sports organizations, front office and support staff, coaches, and athletes on the impact and leadership and culture is what we work on daily. I'm your host, Jeremy Piasecki. I'm the Executive Director of Culture in Sports, and I'm also a panelist for today's webinar. And I'd like to introduce you to our Culture Roundtable. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss the human toll of the athletic scandal and why it is so hard to do the right thing. I'd like to now introduce you to the special group of panelists. First, we have Robert Boland. He's a nationally known sports law professor and practitioner, and he joined the faculty at Seton Hall after serving 5 years in a first of its kind national role as the athletic integrity officer at Penn State University. He's also been a faculty member at several universities for over the past 20 years. He's also published in several leading law journals and has a book on name, image, and likeness under contract. Erin Aldrich Sheen. She is recognized as one of the top dual sport professional athletes and Olympians of all time. She was a U.S. Olympian in track and field, and she was also on the U.S. national volleyball team. She was named the Big 12 Athlete of the Year, had 4 high jump national championships, and held a collegiate record. She also had 8 first-time All-American honors in both volleyball and track and field. She competed in 4 world champions for USA track and field and competed professionally in volleyball. She also holds an MBA. Sarah Dershori, and I apologize. She is the principal of Vestry Late. She also founded it. It's a boutique consulting firm advising organizations confronting high-stakes misconduct issues and how to create safe and inclusive environments. She was also a senior counsel with Human Rights Watch, where she researched and advocated on issues relating to international justice and the handling of sexual assault cases in the United States. Next, we have Michael Chapman. He's a member of the Corporate Tax and Transactions Service line of Shoemaker's Toledo office. He practices, and his focus is on the world of athlete safety and safe sport compliance. He also includes the protecting of young victims from sexual assault and abuse, and he is a safe sport authorized individual. He advises numerous sports organizations on creating, reviewing, and updating policies and processes and independent investigations. And finally, we have Don McPherson. He's the CEO, author, educator of McPherson Enterprises. He was an All-American quarterback at Syracuse University and is a veteran of the NFL and Canadian Football League. And he's now transitioned to becoming an author, educator, and consultant of leveraging a college football Hall of Fame career and the power and appeal of sports to address complex social issues. And I'd like to turn this panel now over to Bob Boland, who will be leading us the rest of the way.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate it. Imagine that Piasecki would struggle with a name ever. At any rate, this is a group of people that I couldn't imagine being closer to or having greater admiration for collectively what you've done. And I followed each of your careers or engaged with you in meaningful ways. For the next 50 or so minutes, we're going to walk through some of the issues around athletic scandal, hopefully define them, but really talk about 2 questions. Why it takes so long to do the right thing? Why are we in these morasses of things that don't change or don't change quickly? And second, can we calculate a human toll from this? Can we not talk about that a school was on probation or that the situation cost $500 million in legal fees, but how many people did it affect? And is there a possibility of moving toward a better human-focused model of crisis recovery and focus? I will start off with a very quick plug, shameless plug. Don McPherson's book, Throw Like a Girl, is on my shelf, one of my favorites, and we'll do that. And if any other authors, any other panelists have a book coming out, we'll plug it the next time. But shameless.
Bob, usually shameless plugs come from the individual themselves, so I appreciate that.
No, it's a shameless plug from me. But it's a good book. It's talking about a real problem, and we have, if you think about it, between Michael, Sarah, and myself, people that have worked at great length of kind of crisis management, crisis cleanup, and putting in rules around this. In Aaron and Don's case, we have high-level athletes who've been in this arena, who know the price of it. And in Jeremy's case, I think we have a remarkable individual whose doctoral thesis is in crisis recognition and recovery, and how we can do better. And I wanted to kind of get an idea and get all the panelists in on this one at some point. But one of the really important questions that I keep seeing is, what are the range of athletic scandals? How do we define scandals in sport? It seems there's so much good in sport, but it seems that tragedy or scandal always stalks the footsteps of the good. Do we have any thoughts on why that is? And I know it may be a philosophical question we'll never answer, but take a quick shot at it if anybody wants to jump in on that one. Why do we have so much bad seemingly stalking the good?
I'd be more than happy to jump in on that one, Bob. You know, that's something I thought about for a long time. Before I wrote the book I published, I wrote a book titled "I Thought It Mattered," which was all about the assumption of the altruism of sport. And I grew up in that era where, you know, we quoted Lombardi and we quoted all these great iconic and had these iconic men. I grew up in New York, so the iconic Yankees from, you know, yesteryear, and they weren't all great guys. They weren't all the perfect individuals that we thought they were. And there's this, I always think there's an assumption of altruism. Even the pioneers like Jackie Robinson and Wilma Rudolph, they weren't necessarily social justice pioneers. They were just great athletes with really thick skin who endured the racism of the time, who endured that period of the time. And then we kind of held them up like they did something intentional. It was not. I think that's why I say like the assumption of altruism. And I think that because of that, because we've held athletes in years past as these heroes, that when there's a fall from that, we tend to think there's a controversy or a scandal when it's really humanity. It's really humanity on display. We're fallible, and these are not necessarily people who are in the sports world. And I can get into I think the biggest controversy of our time now is Live Golf and Charlie Baker suggesting that we should allow gambling into college athletics. I mean, those are signs that we have never really truly embraced sport as this altruistic place that is, to your point, for the full human experience. We've gone from this myth to the business.
Aaron, you were a high-level athlete in two sports. All business, mostly myth. Where do you come down on life experience in that category?
So yeah, I mean, I agree with Don in this situation. You know, for me, it started out as being a 6-year-old girl who went to my parents one day after watching the 1984 Olympics. Don't do the math on that. And I'm old. And telling them that I wanted to be an Olympian one day because I was so inspired by the Olympic movement. It had such an impact on me watching that first Olympic Games and the opening ceremonies. And so from that moment, it was my mission to make an Olympic team. So I would add to Dawn's answer, which I think was a very good one, and just say that, you know, when finances and the imbalance of power, either or both, are involved in sports, there becomes scandal. And because people just can't separate that from what is best, from the altruism. And so, I would just say that those two pieces, particularly, I'm coming from my personal experience of both of those coming into play. I think those are two major factors.
Sarah, you've made a pivot in your career and have one of the leading firms looking at it where power has been imbalanced or not quite fairly used. Do you have some thoughts on the present state of sport based on your experience?
So, okay. First of all, thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here with all these other panelists. But I was going to say too, with respect to your first question, that I do think that there are these kinds of problems in every context, but that there's so much importance placed on sports in the culture, and people project so much, as Aaron and Don were saying, mythology and beliefs and into sports figures, that I think that it has outsized attention paid to it, and so it is I think more visible and therefore more prone to scandal, as you would say, because it's so much in the public eye and there's so much emotion wrapped into sports related things. But I do think when we started Vestry late, I don't think that we realized we would end up in the sports world quite as much as we have been, which has been very interesting. But as I've learned a lot about it, the thing that is key is exactly what you said, the power imbalance, right? You really see that for starting with coaches and kids and young sports, that there's a lot of feeling that the coach controls the child's future, maybe their educational opportunities, opportunities to be on sports teams, that there's a huge amount hinging on that person. And so the power imbalance is really, really, really like greater than in other contexts because of this increased emphasis and idea that the person's future really hinges on that person. And then adding to that, if they're a member of a team, there are a lot of disincentives to report or come forward because your teammates may also have their future riding on this coach if the coach is suspended. So there are additional factors, I think, that make sports even tougher to get people to come forward and create maybe an even greater power imbalance than in other areas where you might be able to move to a different coach or to a different industry more easily. And the circles are really small, as we all know, like people talk and everybody, there's a lot of, interdiscussion amongst the community. So it can feel hard to escape from whatever story it is that you have if you're in a specialized sport.
If we pull apart most of our crises, it feels like there is always a use or imbalance of power, and there always feels to be the pressure of people to not come forward or to be disbelieved when they come forward, to be cut out from the herd, if you will, in doing that. And Jeremy, you've done a lot of work in toxic environments and crisis recovery. And this may be too early to address the big question, but and I think our other panelists have addressed it, but anything in particular in sport that allows us to cut out the people who share the bad stuff with us rather than react to it in a positive way. I think about my own Penn State experience that a president, a director of police services, and an athletic director all went to jail for not reacting to something they were confronted with, rather than treating it with some measure of, well, we don't necessarily know whether it's true, but we must look into it, kind of the idea of, I can describe it as equanimity. Are there some things in sports organizations, Jeremy, as a coach, as an athlete, that you've experienced that makes it more prone to this? And maybe it is everything we've said, the myth of altruism, the other things, but go ahead and share your thoughts on this.
There's so many different ways I could actually go with this, Bob, but to start off with, we're all human, right? We all have our own lived experiences. We all have our values that we grew up with and that we continue to refine over the years. We also have our own perceptions. And so that's the start of any, any interaction between human beings, and that interaction could be positive or negative, right? So some things I wanted to touch on is like Don and Sarah were saying, in today's day and age, a lot of things are happening not because people want to do the right thing. It's because they no longer want to be in the negative light of the press or on social media. And so a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of organizations are reactive versus proactive. And it's not just limited to sports. I mean, it's every industry on the planet has the same issues, but it's highlighted a little bit more because of sports, because there's so many fans in sports, regardless of the level, whether it's, recreation soccer or, professional football or, anything, in between, or especially the Olympics, like Aaron was talking about, whether it was the 1984 Olympics or if it's the 2024 Olympics. There's always going to be a scandal, but are the athletes going to stand idly by and say it's okay that an athlete was treated that way, or it's okay that something else happened, or are the athletes going to start voicing their displeasure? Are the athletes and the coaches are they going to start going to the authorities? And those are really big things to think about. Another thing that some of you were talking about already is whose team, in a team setting is it? I'm recently working with 2 teams who asked me to help them navigate through some transition, with different coaching and stuff. And one of the topics that I talked with them at length was about whose team is this? Is this the coach's team or the athlete's team? And regardless if I talk to an athlete or a coach, the answer always is the coach. But it is truly the athlete's team. They're the ones competing. They're the ones who are putting the blood, sweat, and tears every single day on the field or in the pool or on the court. And they're the ones who, especially, in the professional or collegiate sports arena, they're the ones who are putting fans in the stands. And those are important things to think about when it comes to whose team it is, or who the stakeholders are, or who should be a ultimate decision maker. If it continues to only be one-sided, of course, there's going to be lots of bad decisions that continue to escalate into a scandal, and there's not going to be a lot of voice in it. And those are just some things to think about. I could talk about this for hours, so I'll pass this back on to you.
Let's pull Michael in, because you talked about the idea of whose sport is it, and Michael, you were one of the early employees in setting up the auditing process of national governing bodies at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. And the Center for Safe Sport, the product of federal law to prevent some of these situations. From your perspective, Michael, whose sport is it? And particularly with regard to the national governing bodies that include youth sport, elite sport, professionalized sport, and aspects there. How do we see it? How do we see it from the Olympic model?
I think that's a pretty complicated question, because I think at every NGB you can see kind of variations and differences in the way they operate and how they're designed, and whether they have youth activities that are associated with them or not, if they're purely an Olympic model that's trying to develop for national. It can all be different as to whose sport. I think it changes from all of those factors. I do think at the end of the day, it should primarily be focused on how are we doing the best for the athletes. And I think the center has that focus. I think NGBs are starting to have more and more of that focus. The ones I work with now in my role, but even the ones I worked with at the center, the focus is on, okay, what are we doing here? What is the goal? What is the purpose? And while, yes, the purpose is making the Olympics and being successful there, they're kind of realizing that the sport should be owned and should be built around how do we make it successful for the athletes. I think it's a slow process, because I don't think that was the case in the past, but I think it's slowly moving that direction where people are acknowledging, okay, no, this really is about the athletes. How are we doing what's best for athletes, from 5 and 6 year olds potentially in any sport? Like, you start playing soccer at 4 or 5 years old. How do you make it beneficial for them and protect those athletes all the way up through Olympic level, and those trying to compete at the highest level at the Olympics Olympics or other international events. And I think we're heading in a good direction with a lot of national governing bodies. I think to the point of not wanting negative information or negative publicity out there, I think has started to shift that focus and refocus some governing bodies and some people in the Olympics on that. But I will also say, and this is something as everybody was talking about, and Aaron hit on it too, I specifically want to mention, there is still a commercialization in sports that has exploded over the last century that I think has contributed to this tremendously, where when there wasn't that level of commercialization, the level of monetary gain available both to athletes but also to coaches and to other administrators, because the better you do, the more money you make. I think it was probably easier before the commercialization to do the right thing and to focus and say it is about the athletes, because that's why we're all here. We're not here to make money. We're not here for this or that. We're here for the athlete. And I think the commercialization is part of what took people away from that at some point.
I think that's a very good point, that money and success and the urgency of the moment in sports has created, and commercialization has created a bunch of clouds to doing the right thing or seeing the right thing. Michael, let's talk about it from your Safe Sport perspective. You bring something unique to it. Safe Sport was sort of founded by the Nassar situation, wasn't it? I mean, that was really the driving force into codifying the law. But when we think about Nassar and we break it down, or at least the Athlete A movie version of it, it really is a bunch of different things, right? It's a national governing body that was blind to coaching abuse, and that Nassar was allowed to work inside that environment because they were trying to get to an Olympics, win gold, put out a new national team, and they didn't want to know about the abusive coaching that they had. So Nassar was sort of a byproduct of that. So when his allegations came up, they were just all packed up in the idea we don't want to hear about it, right?
Absolutely. If you look at that case, there are so many angles and so many things you can look at it, but one of them is the Karolyis kind of, I think, skated by. Yes, they're out at the Olympics and there are some things that have happened to them, but I don't think enough attention was paid to, they were the enablers, which I think is something we'll probably talk about moving forward. Of they enabled the behavior by Larry Nassar because they believe Larry Nassar was helping them win, and USA Gymnastics by enabling the Karolyis to coach and run the Karoly Ranch the way they wanted to, because they were being successful and more successful than USA Gymnastics had ever been prior to. It kind of snowballed where they're allowing the Karolyis to do this, and the Karolyis then are protecting Larry Nassar, and it kind of just builds from there. It even parallels the Jerry Sandusky situation at Penn State, where people in the athletic department protected him, and then the president protected the athletic department because he saw the success of the football program. It kind of snowballed from there.
And there was a perception of virtue attached to success too, right? It was a good thing, not just for the institution. It was a good thing for everybody. There was virtue attached. Don and Aaron, I got to bring you both back in as quick as I can to this. Aaron, as an Olympic athlete, you know the pressure of the now, of the cycle, of the events that you have as an opportunity to make it to a trials, to make it to a team, and everything that has to go right. How much pressure is that? And does it come from the national governing body through the coaches to you? And does that prevent you from being all you could be in that moment?
Yes, I think that it's very, very difficult. You have a reputation and a goal in mind as an athlete that you cannot tarnish. And there's really no way to sound the horn, I guess, when you're an athlete and something's happening to you. Because it could mean, and whether it is or not, it feels to the athlete as though, that's the end of their career potentially. So you just stay silent, which is what happened in my case in particular. But I also want to go back to what Michael said and capitalize on the word enablement, because I think that is a huge issue when it comes to abuse. It was in the Nasser case, and it was in almost every other case of abuse that you see in sports. In my particular case, there was also enablement because, my coach continued to go from one school to the next, to the next, to the next, because there was, too much on the line for the university, probably going back to finances and reputation, to say, no, this has to stop, and we're going to be the first one to stand up for this. Instead, we ended up just tying his hands behind his back and saying, you must go to the next university, and we're just going to part ways quietly. And then the cycle began all over again. So I think that there is that common theme in sports of enablement. And I absolutely think that it's difficult to answer your question for the athlete to come forward in the actual time that it's happening to them, which is why it took me over 20 years to come forward. I'm deeply appreciative of my class action lawsuit representatives who came forward when it was actually happening. But again, it got pushed under the rug. And then we were called out for, what is it? Bob, you help me. We were called out for waiting too long to come
statute
forward.
of limitations.
The statute of limitations. Sorry, how could I forget that? But yeah, it was the statute of limitations that we
which is a terrible thing when we're talking about the right thing, right? It is not a good answer. And part of one of the reasons why, and I think the Center for Safe Sports is somewhat imperfect, but the Center of Safe Sport has no statute of limitations for their action, which is a difficult thing if you're on the respondent side, but it's probably a good thing for getting to justice and in managing that. Don, you've obviously been an athlete at the highest level, experienced anything that an athlete can experience in the process, but you've also taught and coached people how to break cycles and to be leaders and stand up in that minute. Why don't you share a little bit about that and react to some of what Aaron just shared, but some of why it's so hard to break cycles here and why it's so hard for bureaucracies to recognize this?
Yeah, I think to Aaron's point that when you go back to coaches moving from school to school, or you mentioned the Larry Nasser case, I think one of the reasons for the lack of accountability and why it makes it so difficult for people to come forward is for a very, very long time, the misogyny, sexism, homophobia, and all the other underlying issues that lead to these problems in sport have been going on in plain sight. There was no accountability prior to sort of women coming in and people from the LGBTQ plus community coming in, and for people of color to all of a sudden have a voice, not a voice just like I'm the black guy who gets to play quarterback at Syracuse, but I'm the black guy who no one cared about whether or not I graduated from Syracuse, but to have that voice. And I think, the one thing that I'll disagree with Michael on, I don't think that sport was ever good for athletes. I think youth sports has been one of the worst things for young people. We've driven the ones who are good into specialization, and we've discarded the ones who didn't win for their parents and their community. We created travel leagues and discarded the kids who just wanted to go play. We turned play into the enemy of sport, and because of the business of sport. And I think right now the Olympic sports are in threat in the Power Five because of NIL and because of all the money, and all of a sudden the Olympic sports are under siege at that level because they're not bringing in the revenue, or they're not generating the kind of revenue. I think that in so many ways, those assumptions that sport was doing all these things allowed it, and because we held it in sort of we considered it the meritocracy. And by the way, this is another reason why we discard athletes who may disclose or may say something. All of a sudden, they can't take it. They can't hack it. So we get rid of them, and because they don't represent the sort of the meritocracy that we think sport is. And so I do think that, and I've seen it. I remember when I was very outspoken about being a black quarterback out of high school, and then in college. I wrote a letter to all 28 GMs before the draft. Coming out, I was considered the best player in college football, but wasn't draftable in the NFL. So I wrote a letter to all 28 owners saying, "Don't draft me if you're not going to play me at quarterback." And it was purely because I was a black quarterback. And I remember a couple years later, I had the captain of the team I was playing with, the Houston Oilers. And I was outspoken about something in the middle of practice, because what was happening would have been an OSHA violation if there was such a thing in the NFL. And I had the captain of the team, a guy named Robert Lyles. He's a coach now in college. He said to me, "Hey man, it's their ball. Just shut up and play. It's their ball." And that was the message to, you don't have the right to, you don't have the voice to say that this is a problem, that this is my game, this is my body. No, I was owned by the Houston Oilers. I was owned by the Philadelphia Eagles. I was owned by the sponsors and the dollars. And that's always been, I think, one of my favorite movies is I think it's called Leatherheads with George Clooney, about the early days of football. I mean, if you watch that film, it goes back many, many years to predating the NFL, and it was all about who had the money. It wasn't about the athletes. It wasn't about protecting them.
The ownership of the game was the person who put it on, right? Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
That way.
We were the circus. We were the circus, and now the big tent is now electronic.
Jeremy, I know I wanted to go to you, and then I want to get Sarah and Aaron back kind of in the circle here. So if we can do that, Jeremy, go ahead.
So I want to talk about 4 different things here. The first is the pass the trash phenomenon. And some people have heard it, some people have not. And basically it was identified a number of years ago. I see Erin shaking her head, so she already knows what I'm talking about. It's where educators go from one school or school district or state to another because they committed some sort of crime or they lost their teaching license. And the school district makes an agreement with the educator to say, we won't say anything negative about you. We'll even write you a letter of recommendation if you leave. And a lot of that time it happens, and teachers who continuously make the same, gross issues, continue to work and continue to move on. And only the people who were adversely impacted are the ones who know what actually happened. And they see later in the years that, an educator sexually assaulted or sexually harassed a student. And then you're sitting there saying, well, that also happened to me 10 years ago. Why is this person still teaching? Why did the school district do this? Why did the state not revoke the license, even though there were numerous complaints? And so those are some things to think about because it happens again in all industries, but it also happens in sports. And in sports, there's actually a huge crossover between educators and coaches. A lot of them it's the same person filling both roles. So that's something big to think about. And we could talk, over several webinars just on that phenomenon. Next thing I want to talk about, and it's similar to what I was just talking about with Pass the Trash, is organizations are worried about wrongful termination lawsuits from coaches and the negative press instead of actually focus on what the issue is. So in Erin's case, she was adversely impacted, not only by coaches, but by organizations. And their focus was, well, we can't terminate the coach because there will be a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, even though potentially there could be 20 multi-million-dollar lawsuits from athletes, but athletes are afraid to speak up because they're afraid about what may happen to them. And it's not only their position on a team or their ability to compete, but it's the level of coaching. Even if Erin were to go to another team, but if she were to say something beforehand, coaches talk, organizations talk, she's automatically going to be blackballed. And anyone could argue that with me all day long. No, the process is safe, it's anonymous. It's not. And it's unfortunate because athletes like Erin can't truly speak up and say what's happening because of the fallout that she'll receive. And it's seen, at Safe Sport. I'm sure Michael's seen it several times. You saw it at Penn State, Bob, as the athletics integrity officer. I'm sure you've seen it all around. And the last thing I want to talk about was owning bodies. And Don brought that up. And I'm sure anyone who's been an athlete has felt that the team owns your body. They have the ultimate say in what that is. But in reality, and a lot of people don't realize this, the only organization who could actually ever own a body in the US is the US government. So, and what I mean by that is if you're in the military, the government actually owns your body. They can tell you what you can and can't do with it. They could adversely penalize you if you do something that detracts from your health, like mental, physical, emotional health. but teams can't do that. But teams can say, well, we're not going to renew your contract, or we're going to trade you away, or we're going to remand you to a position that you're never going to get any
Threat of losing
playing
your
time and
career,
stuff like
right?
that. Yeah, it's a career ender. And
Yeah.
so even though this all should be the athlete's team or the player's team, it truly still is the owner's team and the coach's team. And until younger generations start to realize that this is truly an issue and they own their own bodies, and that they are the final determiner of their success, this will continue generationally.
Sarah, I want to come to you both in response to sort of those issues, and are all workplaces have these problems? Are some more heightened in sport? And is the use of power more prevalent in sport?
Okay. So first of all, so much of what Jeremy and Aaron said, struck hot buttons with me too, because that passing the trash thing just drives me nuts. I know, and I feel like the incentive has always been, oh, we're afraid of defamation, let's just sweep this under the rug. But I'm hoping that that's moving now, that people see the cost of what happens when they find out someone terrible has a history that has been kept silent before, right? So when people call for references, not saying anything, and I know that there has been an idea of having a database about people who've had complaints about them, coaches and whatnot, created, so that there is not just the safe sport, but also within universities and that kind of thing, so that it's easier to figure out where there've been red flags before in other settings. And I know that like the conservative traditional legal perspective has been not to say anything negative, but I do feel like there's now additional risk associated with bringing on people or passing on people who are problematic. But I think overall, the power dynamic that we've talked about, that Jeremy mentioned, that Aaron mentioned, about people feeling like their careers are over if they come forward, create a real imperative to come up with creative ways to check on the health and safety of athletes, so that the burden is not just on athletes to come forward and report, but to think more broadly about what you can look for, what you can do, how you can perform spot checks on organizations, on teams, on clubs, so that the national governing bodies or the other associations responsible for ensuring the safety of athletes are actively taking a look to make sure that somebody reports that they don't experience retaliation. If there are clubs that have bad signs,
you have some indicia of that? I'm sorry to cut you off.
Oh, yeah.
Are there some attributes or indicia that you think you'd recommend in that scenario?
Oh, yeah. So this, I find this so interesting because we've been thinking about this for NGBs who are more proactive. The fear is, I love that Safe Sport is created. It's absolutely necessary to have an independent investigative body, but wouldn't want people to say, oh, Safe Sport is handling it, so now we don't have any, we don't have to do anything. So thinking about what clubs can do. And I think in a lot of sports, people kind of know, there are things you'll hear ethics complaints, you'll notice things. There's a lot, I think, at least in the sports that I've looked at, there's a little bit of a rumor mill and things about certain coaches who maybe are too touchy-feely, or, places where things aren't quite comfortable or right.
But they mean well.
But they mean, or so and so, or they're successful, right? I do feel, and getting back to your first question, this is true in other contexts too, but I do feel if you're winning, or if you're extremely successful, at your job, and you're considered essential to the business, or whatever it is, that people are more willing to look the other way. And it's much harder to get people to take action because, they like the success, and it's easier to just go with that. But it's actually even more essential for businesses and for sports teams or whatever, to demonstrate their values by showing that even people who are doing well, or are top performers in this or that, but behaving in ways that are not acceptable, will face accountability. And that's a key thing for ensuring that kind of behavior will not just continue to grow, and that other people won't see that behavior and feel like that's what's acceptable in the organization, and that's how they should act in order to get ahead, because it really does poison the whole, atmosphere. So it is an opportunity, I think, just to set culture and value straight, to show accountability on those areas. But in any case, I'm going on too long, but I do really think it's important to have creative solutions and to think creatively about ways to lift the burden from the athlete to report abuse, so that other people have eyes on it and are paying attention and are willing to, raise concerns and make sure that people are behaving in ways that are safe and appropriate.
Sarah, I have one follow-up to get a little deeper with you. And we alluded to the idea of pushing problems down the line, or kind of what I would almost describe as almost the idea of not purposeful indifference, or should these things be actionable against the institution? So the idea that, and I hate to allude to Erin's situation ahead of her and having her do it, but the idea, when I've reported something, the institution is much less afraid of me as the reporter than they are of the person who I'm reporting against. And is there a way to rebalance those scales?
I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, that's a great question. And I know we're in an interesting position. And I do think that there is some fear of litigation does actually have some, value in terms of making people focus on the issue and weigh the cost benefits slightly differently. And so in some cases, that I found very interesting, that they've had, especially now with more success in some of these lawsuits against institutions that have failed athletes and others who've come forward, that as part of the settlement, they're requiring better measures be put in place and have monitors overseeing to make sure that those measures are actually implemented effectively over time, that are independent and do public reports either to the court or generally it's available publicly. I think that helps. I think public transparency and public accountability can go a long way in terms of pushing.
We've had that conversation before.
Yeah, that's right.
Erin, and we promised you could be as comfortable as you want, and you've alluded to it, but you made claims against a coach for improper treatment and an improper relationship. You can be as oblique with that as you'd like to be, because you're among friends and we think that you're amazing. So, but you've also been very brave, and you took on the NCAA, you took on your university, because they weren't helping you.
Yeah, so, my situation was, somewhat interesting, because like I said earlier, it took me over 20 years to come forward because there was just too much to lose when it was actually happening. And speaking to, I believe it was Sarah that made this point, I was winning. I was winning national championships. My coach was seen as very successful. So that almost made it even more difficult. But when I was winning national championships and when the behavior from him had stopped with me, it started with my teammates. And those teammates are the ones that I'm very proud of, because they are actually the ones that came forward at that time when I couldn't. Their stories were pushed under the rug. And, this is all public information, so I'm not speaking of anything that is private, but, he had licked one of their necks and he had kissed their feet and come into her dorm room, early in the morning. And those behaviors from the university, when they were reported, were simply said that it was just, unfortunate behavior by the coach, but it was not, it was not sexual abuse or anything to that effect. So, they were kindly kind of encouraged to move to another university, and, he would be kind of pushed out. But it was kind of like, okay, now that we've got you out of here and you out of here, like, I think we're good. Like, nobody's here anymore that's doing any of those things. And so, it was just pushed under the rug. I am very, very appreciative of Safe Sport. So thank you, Michael, for all that you've done with them. I know that they're very, very overwhelmed with the number of cases reported, but I feel as though I really wouldn't have had a place to go even now, had it not been for Safe Sport being the platform that I could report to, because my coach, when I reported 20 years later, was coaching high school girls, and that was kind of, the straw that broke the camel's back for me. And then, I thought I've got to come forward with this. So Safe Sport gave me that voice, gave me the ability to communicate what had happened to me and what had happened to my teammates. And that was the only way that we were able to move forward. But I do think it's really interesting about values and, these universities and these coaches and administration that, what are their actual values? Are their values aligned with what should be happening with the athletes? Because the sport, the team really is the athletes. Without the athletes, there is no team. So I think it's pretty simple, but it's the waters are also very muddy when you talk about that, because the school and the NCAA, they're the ones with the money, right? So, and then you go back to the money issue. But anyway, for a long answer to your question, yes, I do think that, it is very difficult to communicate what happens, and sometimes it doesn't happen until years and years later. But I do love it that we have a place to report now, and I just wish that the NCAA would be more on board with some policies and procedures as to how that's supposed to function on the collegiate level, instead of it just being on the NGB and U.S. Olympic Committee and Paralympic Committee level.
We have about 12 minutes left, and Don, I want to go to you, because you've been a leading voice inside the institution. You've been a leading voice outside the institution. And when I listen to Aaron talk about this, I think a coach taking liberties with one athlete romantically isn't a whole lot different than Nasser not getting caught. Or why have the institutions set up to and I don't think it's a whole lot different than not having African American quarterbacks, or treating women as candy to a degree, or in that kind of environment that coaches can have these relationships. Why aren't institutions outraged by this? Why do they seem to be more outraged at either the monitoring program that comes up, or the lawsuit, or the reporting? Why aren't they mad at the people who do it?
Yeah, what I said before about things happening in plain sight. There's only one institution that rivals Congress as the old white male environment, and that's higher education. If you look at college presidents, if you look at trustees, if you look at the big donors, they're overwhelmingly white and male, and don't care about. And by the way, this gets to another issue that's sort of related to what's going on with boys in our culture, because the leadership in higher education is white and male, and doesn't really care. They're not there to develop athletes to be better people. They want their teams to be winners, and they want their coaches to be winners. And there's no mandate on coaches to be educators. And I've always said this: unless your athletes are making more money than you, your job is an educator first. And we don't require that of coaches, even in higher education. We don't have learning standards in higher education. We don't have learning standards in schools around athletics. And yet we pour, as Sarah mentioned, an outsourced, I'm on a campus where we spent $100 million on a roof for a building that's used by 3 teams, a handful of times that year. I mean, we haven't put $100 million in one building for one academic unit, like in totality. And so when you look at the outsized importance, and it's not just the campuses that have $100 million roof on a football facility or basketball facility, it's the campuses that use their athletic department to increase their diversity numbers in Division II and III sports, that use athletics because those diversity numbers allow them to apply for different kinds of funding, right? Because they increase it. So there's many different ways in which athletics supports the institution financially that don't always show up in just seats in the stands, but in the procedure of the institution, in the Ivy League, and in different ways in which it lends to the donor class, again, predominantly white and male. So now all these challenges are coming up And there is a real, this is not just a MAGA movement, Make America Great Again. There's a real movement to make athletics in higher education not white male again, but male again. I mean, look at what's going on with NIL at the very highest level. We are weeding out those who aren't making the money.
I want to turn, Don, I'll come to you with the pivot question, but one of the big questions is, and I think everybody's answered so eloquently why it takes so long to do the right thing. There are so many mechanisms and built up barriers to even recognizing the right thing. How can we, and this is something I wrestled with in my role, and I've looked at some of the attendees and the in the background. It feels like we want to always fire our way out of these situations or proclaim them over, rather than provide some version of I hate to use the word restorative justice because it has meaning that maybe more than I want to have. But how do we recognize the impact on the people and give them some measure back for that? Either a recognition, either just an understanding of this, rather than a 100-page report. But hey, we messed this up and we're really sorry, kind of, and we're going to change in this way. And this is for everybody. So how can we change our model from just removing the problem, but to actually recognizing the human toll that these athletic scandals take?
Well, Bob, I think you answered the question while you were saying it, and it comes down to accountability. Me as the coach, am I willing to take accountability for my own actions, or the things that I say, or the things that I hear and choose not to take action on? Am I going to take accountability for them? Is the GM also going to take accountability? Or is the team owner, or is the director of athletics at a top 10 Division I school going to take accountability for what happened under their watch? And that's what it comes down to, is accountability. But the problem is accountability has adverse impact on the fiscal bottom line. Is if we take accountability, we're automatically going to be paying out millions of dollars. We might potentially lose or get less on a TV contract because of a huge scandal. And so there's truly, at all levels of sport, and I truly say this, even at the youngest levels of sport, accountability is easy for me to say, or for Sarah to say, or Aaron, but when it comes to dollars, and I'm the chancellor of a university, do I want to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, or do I want to make it all go away for $500,000 or $1 million? And I don't have to take accountability in that sense. And of course, the dollars are going to be what truly drives these answers. But it comes down to accountability.
Sarah, you live in that world a little bit. Is the accountability at the end more dangerous than the accountability in the real moment? Are vitamins better than bandages in this case, or?
I hate to choose between vitamins and bandages, actually. So, but Bob, when you talk about impact and human impact, I think of that as something that really resonates with me on an individual level, because one of the things that I feel is not necessarily sufficiently addressed ever is that when people come forward, there is a moment when how they're responded to makes a huge difference on their path to recovery. If they're supported, if they're heard, if they're treated with respect and dignity, they can recover and move forward in a way that is much healthier and easier. But if they're if they're dismissed, if they're treated with disrespect, if they're disbelieved, it can add to their trauma. And for me, for institutions, for bodies that are responsible for caring for these people, if people are not trained in how to respond when someone comes forward, if they don't have avenues with people who are educated in trauma and understand how to respond to these kinds of concerns and complaints, that it's inexcusable, but it also really, it's adding to the trauma. So to me, it's like you might not be able to prevent all the abuse, but you should try, but after the abuse, to add to the trauma is just totally unacceptable. And so I think that there needs to be places that for everybody to go, that they know that they can go to ask questions, to raise concerns, where they're going to be treated appropriately to
And Bob,
minimize the negative impact. Yeah.
sorry,
Bob,
Sarah, I
go ahead.
didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to, I've got to say this because I won't be able to sleep if I don't get this off my chest. I've spent, I was 29 years, I retired from football at the age of 29. That was 29 years ago. So I've spent half of my life doing work around men's violence against women and trying to get men into that conversation. And the terms like accountability are, it's a post-event term. Something bad has had to happen. And what we don't do is we don't look at this from the sports perspective. We don't do that in sports. We don't wait till after the game is over and then start saying, well, who did what? And how did we do that? We prepare knowing that there are pitfalls, knowing that we have an opponent, knowing that we have to do something. So we prepare with all those contingencies in mind. So we prepare, as I always say, for the heat of the moment. And so if we're truly, we have to be honest about this. We have to be honest about where we're going right now in college athletics. And I can speak specifically to my sport. We know that the Power Five is throwing more money into the problem. And you know what's not happening? And I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to call people out, but you're going to have the top players in college football in 5 years from now who are none of them are going to have college degrees. They're all going to go through the finest higher education system in the world. You know why? Because they're going to transfer, because they're chasing money, or they're coming out early, or and that is fundamentally your job in higher education. So if you're not doing your fundamental first job, and you're not doing that because of the money, then what are you all about? And I think when you start talking about, and that's just like a team, right? If you're not practicing, I'll go back to my sport, blocking and tackling. If you're not practicing that, what are you doing? And so I think that it's very clear. And by the way, doing work that I do around boys in our culture are struggling for a lot of reasons. And I blame sport for that, because we're not teaching boys to be better men through football. I'm on the board of the New York City chapter. Bob, you and I are on the board of the New York City chapter of the National Football Foundation. We talk about building leaders through football. We're not doing that. We're building NIL candidates and transfer candidates through football.
I'm gonna give Aaron the last word, because Aaron, you've been in this arena in a variety of different ways. You are a coach, you are an executive, you're a world-class athlete, and you're a survivor to some degree of this. And with just a couple minutes left, take the last word, please.
Well, thank you for that. I don't believe I deserve the last word, but thank you for that. I guess my last word would be, who is the entity that is responsible for this? It's always been confusing for me since I've taken a serious look at all of this. But I want to read the mission statement of the NCAA right now, just to leave us with. And I want to read the well-being part. So it says, the NCAA was founded to keep college athletes safe. The association is still working hard to protect them physically and mentally. Through its Sports Science Institute, the NCAA provides recommendations and guidelines to ensure college athletes are getting the best care possible. But I have to ask, how are they working hard to protect them? Because I'm still not seeing it. And when we tried to make that change, we were denied. We literally just asked them to do a couple things, put a couple policies and procedures in place, put a database out there where people could, when they report inappropriate behavior or something that is not correct within an institution, to have a database out there and record all of those reports. Simple things that we, no, a college coach can't be on the phone with an athlete by themselves. It's either needs to be recorded, or there has to be, someone else on the phone with them. I mean, there are just little things that we asked for that we were denied. And so it makes you wonder what the NCAA is there for. They're there to put out, to penalize people or coaches for giving their athlete a piece of pizza because they paid for it. For the athlete, because the athlete was hungry, but they're not there to do anything when it comes to abuse. So, I guess my biggest question to leave with is who is responsible for this? It looks like it's just finger pointing to, from the NCAA to the university to the NCAA. Who's responsible for it all?
I can't thank you enough. I can't thank the panelists enough we're up against the clock, and with that, Jeremy, I think we're going to have to end this. If you've been an
Yep.
attendant, a participant, we so appreciate you and Culture and Sport, and thank you all to our panelists.